Candela Saul Rodríguez Labrador was born in 1999 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She lived with her mother, Carola Labrador, and her siblings in the district of Hurlingham, to the west of Buenos Aires City. She was only 11 years old when the events took place, and despite her young age, she had dreams and her eyes set on the future. She was very friendly, and from what people say about her, we could also say she was outgoing and fun. She liked to dance and sing, and she was also part of a Boy Scout group at her neighborhood church. Candela deeply loved her entire family, her wonderful parents, and all her siblings, and whenever she gave them a thoughtful gift, she would leave a little note with kind words. There isn't a single negative thing that any of us could ever say about Candela. She was a flag bearer 3 times, was a good student with excellent grades, and the only thing she ever got in trouble for was talking too much with her friends. Her grades earned her a letter of recommendation to another school she wanted to attend, and for which she needed a scholarship. Unfortunately, she never got to transfer. She used to coordinate her outfits and would spend as much time as needed in front of the mirror to perfect her hairstyle. She was just living her life the best she could, giving love and discovering herself, until her life was taken from her. 2011 was a year of historic events. Between elections and tragedies, there were some very well-known cases, like the French tourists or the quadruple murder in La Plata. The murder of the French women, for example, is probably one of the most well-known cases, one that basically went unpunished because of an investigation that was downright embarrassing. So, in an election year, they needed to make a difference. They had to. Set an example, make a good impression. But the case would prove to be too much to handle. To make the most of her day off, Candela was going to have a snack with some friends at the Meshi's house, and, while she was at it, help organize the Scouts' end-of-year camping trip. So Candela woke up around noon, had breakfast with her family, and then spent some time on the computer. After getting ready, she left her house, said goodbye to her mother, and gave her the phone number of the friend's house she was going to visit, the Mechis. She walked to the corner of her street, went a few blocks, and then disappeared. There were 2 sightings. The first was by a 70-year-old neighbor, one of the last people to see her alive. This neighbor saw her walking away. The other sighting happened when a couple was coming back from grocery shopping and saw her being forced into a pickup truck with 3 men inside. At 5:30 in the afternoon, Candela's cell phone signal was lost in Villa Ballester. Candela's friends never met up with her. She never arrived. Carola went on with her day at home, while her sons went to play soccer. At 4:05 page, 4 of Candela's friends went to her house to look for her, explaining to Carola that they hadn't met up with her yet. They thought she might be there. At that moment, Carola just thought it was a mix-up, that Candela had gone straight to the Mechis' house, so she called the number her daughter had left her. But when she managed to get in touch with them, they told her they hadn't seen her either. They didn't realize something had happened because the other friends hadn't arrived there yet either. When they got back, one of the young woman's brothers stayed at the house to wait in case she came back. Meanwhile, her other brother and Carola went out to look for her on the street. In the midst of desperation and not having any answers, Carola called her sisters to ask for their help. Unfortunately, from that moment on, a 9-day campaign would begin in which the entire country would be searching for any sign of the missing girl. After hours had passed and there was still no trace of Candela, Carola went to the police station to ask for immediate help. Of course, she ran into the usual disrespectful attitudes. She probably ran off with her boyfriend. What kind of boyfriend would an 11-year-old girl have? And even if that were the case, would that have been a reason not to look for her? If she was lured away by an older man, what would they do then? After explaining herself further, 3 patrol cars went out to look for Candela. That night, Candela's father called home, as he usually did, but they didn't want to tell him what was going on. Besides, there was still no news. However, after hanging up the phone, he found out anyway through the news, which was spreading quickly in the effort to find Candela. Alfredo Rodriguez spent the night having a nervous breakdown and taken some pills to calm down. At that moment, no one knew it, but Candela had been taken to a house about 30 blocks away, where she was held captive at 992 Kiernan Street in the town of Villa Tisset. Later, she would spend some time in San Martin. It's impossible to understand this case without knowing that information was hidden and attempts were made to distort what had happened because police officers were involved. Let's look at the events in chronological order. But keep in mind that at the time, everything people were saying, right? It didn't make much sense because clearly too many important details were missing. On August 22nd, the day Candela disappeared, her mother realized around 6 or 7 in the evening that she was missing and that she had never met up with her friends. She immediately went to the police station to report her disappearance. Things started off badly right from the beginning. At the police station, they told her that the chief was out of town for the long weekend and that she would have to come back the next day. We're talking about a missing minor here. She couldn't even really be considered a teenager yet. Carola knew something bad had happened to her daughter, so she sat down at the entrance of the police station and refused to leave until they took her report and started looking for her. After hours of insisting, Carola finally got them to listen to her, and search parties were organized. Just imagine, she had to insist for them to look for an 11-year-old girl. These initial searches didn't turn up any results at all. It's still unclear whether the searches really didn't find anything, or if someone was actually covering up the kidnapping. The truth is, Candela's disappearance became a matter of national urgency, no exaggeration. During the days she was missing, pretty much the only thing anyone talked about on every news outlet and TV channel in the country was Candela's disappearance. There were even campaigns led by the country's biggest celebrities, demanding answers and calling for the girl's safe return. With so much attention, Candela's case also attracted some unsavory people and a lot of horrible theories that put the spotlight on the victim herself. Rumors started circulating, like Candela had run off with a man, that her mother was prostituting her, or that she looked older than she really was. And there were countless other totally disgusting and despicable comments. Let me remind you, and I'll say it again in case it's not clear, she was an 11-year-old girl who, at that point, no one knew yet, but had suffered a horrific crime. And by the way, this is still happening today. In fact, just a quick Google search is enough to see what people think about her. Now, one of the first lines of investigation that were considered came from Candela's father. Something important to keep in mind is that the environment she grew up in was far from ideal. In fact, it was actually pretty bad. To start with, her father, Alfredo Rodríguez, was a criminal. For years, he was involved in what's known as highway piracy, which is basically robbing cargo trucks on the road. At the time of the events, Alfredo Rodríguez had been in custody since 2010 after being caught in a case of highway piracy. Another thing to keep in mind is that several of Candela's relatives, uncles, cousins, were also involved in drug dealing in different areas of Greater Buenos Aires. That's why the focus was on what was happening around Candela's father, who at that time was still in prison. So did prosecutor Marcelo Tavallaro say he found out? It wasn't until 3 days later that it came out Candela's father was in jail, and Carola defended herself by saying she was too embarrassed to admit it, which is why she hadn't said anything. All of this is important, and it's something Carola was criticized for over many years, because people suspected even then that she already knew it was a vendetta against Candela's father. However, the story wasn't quite like that. Also, during those 9 days of searching, the rumors kept getting bigger and bigger. There were all kinds of rumors about this family. Rumors that linked them to drug traffickers and mobsters. Things got so incredibly out of hand that at one point, a service truck came by to unclog the bathroom at Carola's house, and people actually thought the truck was there because they had finally found the young girl dead in the septic tank. But there was no time for pointless arguments. They had to look into Candela's father's background. The investigators on the case went to question him to see if this was some kind of revenge. and if he maybe had the name of someone he thought could be a suspect. At first, Alfredo denied that this was some kind of vendetta against him, or at least that's what was reported in the media. Much later, it came out that Alfredo had actually given names. Both were connected to the Buenos Aires police. One was Hector Morea, a well-known police informant, and the other was Sergio Chazareta, a police lieutenant. This information was never made public while Candela was missing. Meanwhile, the investigation kept moving forward, although, of course, there were no results. 3 days after the disappearance, Carola received a call that left her frozen. A little girl on the other end of the line said, "Hi, Mom, it's Candela." They hung up, called again. The girl said the same thing, and hung up once more. This caused a huge commotion in the house, with people telling her to ask questions, already thinking the case was solved. This person called a third time. Carola answered and tried to ask her something. That's when she heard the girl ask other people behind her because she didn't know what to say. So no, it wasn't Candela. That same day, the first march was held demanding that the girl be found alive. All the marches were organized by her school. There was a lot of commitment from the people who knew her and her family. They wanted to find her, and everyone was anxiously waiting for some positive news. Almost at the end of those tedious 9 days of searching, there were police officers on the rooftops of houses waiting to spot any kind of suspicious activity or anything out of the ordinary. A reward of 100,000 pesos was also offered for any information that could help find Candela. In fact, they were so desperate that they even turned to psychics as a last-ditch effort. A psychic told them that the girl was tied up in the basement of a church, so that's where they went. First, they went to the church where Candela was part of the scout group, and of course, they didn't find anything there. Then, the officers rushed to the church where she had her first communion, but she wasn't there either. Candela was searched for by 1,600 police officers, 2 helicopters, 143 patrol cars, 16 cadaver dogs, and even Interpol, but no one was able to find her. On August 29th, Carola went to sleep and dreamed about her daughter. She was surrounded by men who were taller than her, and she was looking up at them. The next day, a campaign called 48 Hours for Candela began, with several well-known artists participating, and Adrian Suar being one of the first to get involved. The goal was to gather clues through emails, phone calls, letters, whatever it took. They believed that maybe by having famous people participate, the case would get more attention and someone would come forward, perhaps feeling more confident. Unfortunately, the case was about to take a turn that no one wanted. Finally, on August 30th, Carola received a call from Candela's captors. A man told her that they would never see Candela alive again, and that they had to pay the money they owed. Of course, she had absolutely no idea what money they were talking about. The next day, August 31st, the girl's body was found on the side of the West Access Highway. It was a woman who collects cardboard, someone who at that moment was rummaging through the trash 32 blocks from the girl's house in Villa Tesay. Inside a large black trash bag, the girl's arm was sticking out. Her hand was clearly visible, with red painted nails and a costume jewelry ring. Obviously, she ran out terrified to report what she had found. She ended up at a bus terminal where Matias de Salba, an employee who handled the luggage for the buses, heard her. By then, the news about Candela, the missing girl, was everywhere, so it was only natural to think that they had found her. De Salba ran out and saw her, confirming that someone had left a girl in the bag. The highest authorities of the police were present at the discovery of the body, and even the governor of the province at that time, who was Daniel Scioli. At that moment, Scioli was in the middle of an election campaign and had just returned from a medical trip to Italy. Finding the culprits quickly would be ideal for his image to look good in front of everyone. The young girl's hair was tangled, there was a stain at the left corner of her mouth, her lips were swollen, her eyelids were closed, and she had a black eye. Candela's body was taken for an autopsy, which revealed that she had been killed by mechanical asphyxiation, by suffocation. In other words, she was strangled to death, and there were no signs that she had been abused. That is, while she was being held captive. It was also revealed that she had been raped shortly before her death, which was determined to have occurred the day before she was found. Candela Rodríguez was held captive for a total of 9 days. One of the biggest controversies in the case was about the condition of the body when it was found. There were no traces of DNA or anything like that on it. The prosecutor in the case said that it was very likely the body had been washed before being dumped by the roadside. This discovery truly shocked all of Argentine society. The wake was held on September 1st. Candela's father was allowed to leave prison as an exception so he could attend and be with his family. Carola dreamed of her daughter again. This time, she looked at her and told her that everything was okay. From then on, the case became really complicated, since much of the investigation never came to light, mainly because some powerful people were involved: drug traffickers and high-ranking police officers. During the first weeks of the investigation, witnesses and evidence began to surface that implicated several people. One witness in particular claimed to have seen the person who kidnapped Candela while she was being held captive. This protected witness accused several individuals, 5 to be exact. However, most of them were not implicated in the case due to lack of evidence. Out of these 5 people, only 1 ended up being implicated in the case. And that was Hugo Elvio Bermudez, a man who was about 50 years old at the time of the events. Bermudez, who was Uruguayan, lived near Candela's house and was involved in drug dealing in that area. According to the witness, he saw this man entering one of the houses where Candela was held captive. When the police raided that house and Bermudez's house, they found Candela's DNA in both places. He was subsequently charged as a primary suspect in the crime. Supposedly, 2 men had taken Candela by car to a house in Villa Tesey, which is located about 30 blocks away from her own home, and then transported her to San Martin. There was something white in Candela's stomach. Coincidentally, after entering a house at 992 Kiernan Street in Villa Tesey, they found chicken and rice in the fridge. Back at that time, the director, who was the head of the forensic genetics lab of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police, carefully swabbed the entire bowl of chicken and rice in order to collect the necessary biological samples. In the container, they then discovered the genetic profile of a man and a minor, incomplete genetic profile that belonged to Candela. In addition to this, they also collected 14 samples to be examined later. A glass cup also had a bit of DNA matching Candela, but without any visible fingerprints. And that's not the only place. There are no traces of the girl anywhere in that house. Keep in mind that supposedly she wasn't tied up during that time. Also, when she left her house, her hair was in a ponytail, and when they found her, it was braided. In fact, despite all this, no hair from Candela was found in that house. There was no DNA from the accused either. We're talking about people who said they had been there, so the house should have been full of genetic material. A few weeks later, Leonardo Jara was charged, a 30-year-old man at the time, also linked to drug dealing in the area. It was proven that Jara was the one who called and threatened Candela's mother, since the calls had been recorded. And then an expert determined that the voice in the recordings was the same. A third person, Fabian Gomez, 40 years old and also linked to drug dealing, was eventually charged in the case. Hugo Elvio Bermudez, Leonardo Jara, and Fabian Gomez were tried and convicted only in 2017, more than 6 years after the murder. Although it's well known that the wheels of justice can turn pretty slowly, in this particular case, which is full of irregularities, the drawn-out timeline was almost inevitable. Bermudez was charged as the actual perpetrator of the crime, the one who killed Candela, and was sentenced to life in prison. Jara was also sentenced to life in prison, accused of being the one who kept Candela captive. On the other hand, Gomez was sentenced to only 4 years in prison for being an accessory to the crime. At last, after so much time, the case had people convicted. But were these the only people involved? And besides, what was the motive for murdering an 11-year-old girl? Meanwhile, Carola got help from a rather flashy lawyer, someone who jumps into every case that ends up in the media almost as a sport, although he usually charges pretty hefty fees. In this story, it's said that not only did he not charge, but he actually did it somewhat as a favor. Around 2011, a story circulated that Burlando had become involved in the case through Julio Cesar Grassi, a priest who had been convicted of sexually abusing a minor. Grassi acted as a sort of spiritual guide immediately after the girl's abduction. The connection between Grassi and Carola arose because the woman's eldest son attended the school the priest ran in Hurlingham. Journalist Raul Portal explained that everyone who attended the foundation run by this man knew Candela's mother. Her son went to the high school, and the priest couldn't refuse to offer her support. Candela was about to start high school at the same school, so Carola needed support and asked the priest to meet with her to offer spiritual comfort. Grassi found it unbelievable that she didn't have a lawyer to defend her, so he helped look for someone who wouldn't charge her, and incredibly, Burlando agreed to take the case. To understand the underlying plot of this whole case, we need to go back to some things we've mentioned throughout the video, especially about Candela's father. As I mentioned, he was in prison at the time of the events and was connected to criminal gangs. In one of his first statements, he pointed to Hector El Topo Morera as someone who could be involved in all of this. Morera, as we've already said, was a police informant. And it turns out that about 2 weeks before Candela's kidnapping, Miguel Angel Mameluco Villalba had been arrested. Villalba is one of the most important drug lords in San Martin and the Buenos Aires suburbs in general. We're talking about someone who, together with his family, ran drug sales in different parts of the province in a business that moves millions of dollars a day. Villalba had been arrested days before what happened to Candela, after an informant gave up the location of one of his hideouts. So Hector Morera, the informant, supposedly accused Alfredo Rodríguez, Candela's father, of being the one who snitched on Villalba. But what really happened was that it was actually Morera himself who had turned Villalba in, and to cover himself, he blamed someone else, in this case, Candela's father. That's why it's said that, as revenge, Villalba allegedly ordered his people on the outside, right? To carry out this attack against Candela. Another person mentioned by Candela's father in his testimony was former lieutenant, at that time, Lieutenant Sergio Chazarreta of the police. He was involved in business with drug traffickers from the suburbs, and of course, with Villalba as well. Everything points to Chazarreta having facilitated or been involved in Candela's kidnapping. It's said that it was Chazarreta's truck that was supposedly used to kidnap the girl. These 3 people were charged in a second trial as the masterminds behind the crime. Now, Villalba was ultimately acquitted in this case, although he remains involved in other cases, mostly related to illegal substances. Along with Mameluco Villalba, former Buenos Aires police officer Sergio Fabian Chazarreta, informant Hector Horacio Topo Morera, and carpenter Nesta Ramon Altamirano were also acquitted. All of them as accomplices. As for Carola, she always said that, in reality, the justice system is covering up for someone else. That Villalba was just a scapegoat, someone who fit the role of kidnapper, but who wasn't really responsible for this case. Carola claims there was no justice in her case, and that from the very beginning, people who had nothing to do with it were implicated. That's why now they're all acquitted. Because yes, in May 2024, the news broke that I just told you about. Candela Rodríguez case, 13 years later, all those accused of being the masterminds were acquitted. So she questions the justice system a lot, questions what was done and how the investigation was handled. Carola had to leave the neighborhood where she lived. The moron police rented her a house near the train station and covered her rent for the next 9 months. She eventually decided to move in with her family. I assume she wanted to keep a lower profile and be with loved ones, since up until that point, she had been surrounded by all kinds of people. On top of that, Carola ended up needing police protection because of the amount of harassment she was receiving. Let's remember that people believed she was directly involved in her daughter's disappearance. And on top of that, she was getting involved in the business of drug traffickers. Whether or not they were actually the real culprits, she was drawing way too much attention. So, what's the truth? For the prosecution, the case was so poorly investigated that at one point, prosecutor Mario Ferrario even requested that the police chiefs from that time go to trial. Juan Carlos Paggi, who was the head of the Buenos Aires police, his second-in-command Hugo Matzkin, and the head of investigations Roberto Castronuevo. Hugo Bermudez, who received a life sentence for kidnapping Candela, stated that while he's no saint or the best person out there, he didn't commit this crime. He said, "I'm no saint, but I'm not gonna let anyone label me a murderer or a rapist either." The truth is that while I was being held for this case, a record mysteriously appeared accusing me of being an accessory in a truck robbery in Bariloche that happened in 2004. And since they were about to release me for the Candela case, one of the times I managed to get out, although they arrested me again soon after, I accepted a plea deal in the piracy case, because otherwise, I wasn't getting out. Later, I was acquitted in that case. Bermudez defends himself against the accusations. He says he was a truck driver, but had nothing to do with the highway pirates. He also says he neither sold nor used drugs. And what's more, he says there was a lot of lying when it came to the trial and presenting the evidence. He was accused on the grounds that a satellite device with several antennas was found in his house, which is commonly used by highway pirates to track and intercept trucks in order to rob them. All of this would be too much of a coincidence, but Bermudez says that in reality, they never actually presented such a device to the court. When it came down to it, everyone kept passing around the supposed possession of the object, saying someone else had it or it was somewhere else, just to avoid showing it because it didn't exist. To him, this whole thing was like some kind of mafia affair. For Carola, Bermudez is guilty. With all this said then, with all this context about the case, with the whole story I've told you, though I might be missing several details because this is a case that's been going on for 13 years of complete injustice, or at least that's what most people believe. Tell me, what do you think? I assume that a lot of people know this story because, honestly, during that short time when Candela was being searched for, it was really striking. It was everywhere in the media, and people were genuinely worried about what was happening. It was on the news all the time. There were updates every second about what was happening, how they were searching for her, and the efforts being made. So I also assume that many people lived through it minute by minute. So tell me what you think about it. Was justice served? There are also a lot of people upset that Vilbaba was released, at least in this case. But anyway, let me know down in the comments. I'm reading them. And that's really all for now, because there's not much more to tell you. So here are the Patreons and channel makers. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms, and with nothing more to say, here's a new video, here's a recommended video, you can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.